There are two forces vying for total control through the wake of a one-world government. Both are hostile to the natural rights of conscience. One of those forces is the ever-encroaching police state. Recent statements have been released from Washington to report anyone who criticizes certain controversial proposals, either through email discussions or even private conversations. Report your neighbor. This foreshadows the tyrannical police state that is coming. The prophets referred to this power as the beast. Now, whether you believe in scriptural prophecy, there are some that are historically undeniable. We have evidence of this posted on frogstew.org, but now, the second force, vying for total control, is more subtle. Revelation refers to it as Babylon, or the Great Harlot. She will ultimately take the reins. She climbs on the back of the beast. While the people focus on the police state with its erosion of freedom, she will be gaining through deception the minds and hearts of those who see her actually as an ally in the cause of conscience. So the beast will be supplying poison for food. The harlot will provide poison for the antidote.
Welcome to Frog Stew.
If you want to take liberty away from Americans, you have to know how to cook a frog. You cannot cook a frog by putting on a pot of hot water and then throwing the frog in the water, because the frog's reflexes are too quick. And by the time his feet would hit the water, he'd hop away and be free. The way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water. Put the frog in the water and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late.
Big Brother is watching you.
Views expressed on this program do reflect the convictions of thousands of people across the globe.
The most threatening factor to the stability of this country is the polarization of the two races, blacks and whites.
People have left their homes, their careers, their aspirations to establish a new social order in a world tottering towards self-destruction.
Like my little Dusty, Ritalin has been the answer for him.
Today, we have a controlled society, a happy society. We have stability.
So we're in a unique position to give you untainted commentary. We're not motivated by profit or popularity, so our views will not be in the least bit tainted by political correctness.
War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength.
We're in a relentless pursuit of the truth.
You're being fed poison for food and poison for the antidote.
Join us for another serving of Frog Stew.
Before we can show where the harlot is infiltrating society and culture, for the day she will take the reins of power, we have to first identify who she is. Who is the Great Harlot? The truth isn't easy to hear, which is why so-called experts are vague, deliberately vague. Tim LaHaye is one such expert. He's the theological co-author of the 12-volume book series about the last days called Left Behind. Now, just to illustrate the immense interest in the topic of the end of days, each of these 12 volumes was a New York Times bestseller. Left Behind was made into a movie, so for those voting with their dollars, LaHaye is the authority on the subject. So who does he think the harlot is? This is from page 265 of his book, Revelation Unveiled. Babylon is described as a, quote, religion that dominates politics. And he quotes Revelation 17:18, quote, that rules over the kings of the earth. So think for a moment of the religion you think has the best chance of having dominance in the world. The obvious choice is Christianity. It is the largest and most aggressive in their desire for political power. LaHaye realizes this, but being a Christian himself, his comments are defensive. Such a religion, LaHaye writes, is, quote, in distinction from the true Christian church, which has never sought political power. When he writes in distinction from the true Christian church, he's obviously pointing out that throughout history, if you have any knowledge of Western history, you know that Christianity dominated the West politically from 312 AD well through the 17th and 18th century. Now, you might look at history and see Christians as the ones persecuted, like you might have heard the martyr stories where all these Christians were being martyred for the cause of Christ. Maybe you don't see the Christians as the ones in power, but the ones being persecuted. The popular imagery of 3rd century Rome shows Christians being persecuted for practicing Christianity until an emperor named Constantine comes along, ends the persecution by making Christianity a legal practice. The truth isn't so glamorous. Here's a quote from a professor in a PBS documentary on the subject.
The stories of the martyrs that have come down to us are all hero stories, and they're all intended, obviously, as ways of strengthening the faith of those who remain. If we read only those martyr stories, we would suppose that all Christians were heroes and that the church flourishes because of that heroism. Obviously, this is an idealization. We actually tote up the number of martyrs that we can identify. It's a really quite small number over the 3 centuries during which Christianity was in the position of being the outside.
This professor also writes that, quote, "What's most interesting is when the heroic age stopped and when the church itself converted into being a form of Roman imperial culture after the conversion of Constantine in 312. And I think that's, in a way, Christianity's effort to reclaim its own heroic history after it had already become an arm of the government itself and was, of course, persecuting other Christians. More Christians were persecuted by the Roman government after the conversion of Constantine than before. The difference is, it is a Christian government who's persecuting the other Christians." So this is the part of history that you didn't get. You may have heard the martyr stories, and then you might have heard that Constantine came along, made Christianity legal, suddenly Christians were free, and Constantine is the hero. Whereas this historian is pointing out that actually there were more Christians persecuted after Constantine than before, but it was Christians killing other Christians, so those martyrs don't count. So then Constantine makes Christianity the official state religion. This ruthless Christianity is now the only game in town. If there was such a thing as sincere Christians, they were killed off or forced to embrace the right doctrines determined by the party who had gained the power to slaughter their opponents and were willing to do so. So that's what we have, a history of Christians killing other Christians for not having the right doctrine. The Reformation, 1,000 years later, split the church into fractions, yet each part, each division of the Reformation, whether you've heard of the Presbyterians or the Lutherans, these were little fractions that broke off from the Catholic Church in the famous Reformation. Each part still dominated some part of Europe, like the Lutherans dominated Germany instead of the Catholics, or the Presbyterians dominated Switzerland instead of the Catholics. They all broke off. But just because they broke off from the Catholic Church, which was ruthless, responsible for the infamous Inquisitions, where people were tortured by the Catholic Church for their beliefs. Still, these splinters that broke off from the Catholic Church were equally as ruthless in their enforcement of their particular orthodoxy. In other words, no matter where you were in the Christian world, whether it was Catholic or the Reformation world, if you didn't embrace the orthodox truth of whatever state church you happen to be living under, you would be persecuted and often killed. It was always a dangerous thing to hold a religious belief that contradicted the orthodox creed of whatever particular country you lived in. And even today, though the church has been bound from prohibiting the free exercise of religion or the establishing of an official religion in this country, it is still dominated by Christians, and you cannot even be elected to the Senate if you're not a Christian. So clearly, Christianity has dominated the West politically. And if there's some religion that's going to emerge as a political power in these last days, there's no other choice but Christianity. You could say, if you're some kind of sincere Christian, you could say, well, it'll be the bad Christians, but the good Christians will always stay out of politics, which is what LaHaye is trying to say here. He says, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He came the first time to establish a spiritual kingdom, unquote. Now, this part is accurate. Messiah certainly was not interested in building up the kingdoms of this world. He came to establish a radical new society. And in the beginning, they were. They had nothing to do with the affairs of nations. They shared their possessions in common. They worked together so that there were no poor among them. They created a place where orphans and widows could be grafted into families. They weren't trying to make the world a better place. They had an alternative way of life that was a direct contrast to the way of the world, and so they were more of an example or a light to the world. The idea of voting or running for office or fighting in wars or even seeking employment outside of their society was a foreign concept. They came out of the whole paradigm of living for themselves into a life of living for others. And this is what Christians today cannot understand, and it keeps them from understanding the original purpose of the church, which was to be a light to the nations, not to take part in the affairs of the nations. But Tim LaHaye, who is so far removed from this devoted paradigm and so involved in the affairs of making a living for himself, is thoroughly confused. He writes, quote, "Whenever the church as an organization has involved herself in politics, she has forsaken the will of God." But then he adds in the next line, quote, "That does not rule out individual Christians being good citizens and participating in the offices of government," unquote. Well, not only have Christians participated in governments, whenever they had the power to do so, now this is before America separated church and state, but whenever in history they've had the power to do so, they've used the state as an instrument to compel people to conform to their teachings. This is the history that we cannot forget. This is a part of history that is being lost today. Whenever the church has had power to do so, they, by force, compel people to conform to their doctrines. The history of the West, from the early 4th century through the Reformation period, was ruthless. The church tortured, killed those who disagreed with their teachings. The Reformation did not stop this trend. It continued it. The seminaries today that produce the preachers in the churches and on the radio and TV all incubate their students in the teachings of Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant, whose teachings prevailed through the shedding of innocent blood. As Thomas Jefferson put it, quote, millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned." So I'm sure Tim LaHaye did not want to alienate so many of his own evangelical colleagues who are quite politically active. But most intelligent people would look at this statement as a great example of confusion. True Christians don't participate in government, but of course you could vote and you could run for office. Now this is total confusion, which the Aramaic word translated confusion is Babylon. And that's what we're talking about today. Which religion is most aggressively seeking to dominate the governments of the world? It's not Buddhism, it's Christianity. Revelation speaks of this harlot as one who, quote, became a dwelling place of every unclean spirit and every detestable bird. The word became indicates a transition. So whatever group became the harlot, it indicates it wasn't always a harlot. The church wasn't always a harlot. The church was once pure and had nothing to do with this world order. As Paul the Apostle put it, they were betrothed to one husband, though they later played the harlot. Once they were pure, but they became a prostitute. You cannot generalize who the harlot is. You can't say it's some kind of Eastern religion. As one theologian put it, in only a few centuries, Christianity had changed almost beyond recognition. Most Protestants throughout history have maintained that the Catholic Church is the great harlot, but Revelation calls her the mother of harlots. So if the Catholic Church is the mother of harlots, who are her daughters? Well, who are the ones historically who came forth from the Catholic Church? The Protestants. And they also were bloody tyrants who murdered nonconformists just like their mother. So let me just make this clear. There has never been a church state. There's never been a place where there was no separation of church and state as there is in America today, where heretics or anyone who disagreed with the church was not being oppressed. And there's no other religion. And there's no other religion that fits this description of Revelation more than Christianity. A religion that dominates politics, a religion that was once pure but became a harlot. Now, there are Christians today who say Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues were not, in fact, separating church and state, but rather creating a Christian nation. And this effort to indoctrinate a new generation of Christians with this revisionist lie that America is a Christian nation will culminate in a great pressure to remarry the church with the state. And in our next segment, we'll be pointing out exactly how the seeds are being planted that will result in the great harlot once again seizing the reins of power.